The forensic technician lifted the tarp slowly, revealing frozen soil beneath 3 feet of compacted snow. And in that moment, every investigator standing in the clearing went silent, because they knew the partial skeletal remains visible through the ice belonged to someone who had been missing for exactly 63 days. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The body discovered on February 14, 2002, in a remote section of Pike National Forest west of Colorado Springs, would eventually be identified as 22-year-old Jessica Lynn Carpenter, a University of Colorado student who had vanished without explanation during the week between Christmas and New Year's. The case would remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades, a ghost story whispered among locals who remembered the search parties, the vigils, the desperate pleas from her family broadcast on evening news segments that grew shorter and less frequent as winter turned to spring. What nobody understood in those early weeks of 2002 was that the truth had been hiding in plain sight, protected by friendship, by silence, by the assumption that certain people could never be capable of certain acts. Jessica Carpenter grew up in Fort Collins, the middle child in a family of 5, described by everyone who knew her as reliable, thoughtful, and driven. She had completed her fall semester at the University of Colorado Boulder with a 3.8 grade average, majoring in environmental science with plans to work for the National Park Service after graduation. Her roommate last saw her on December 27, 2001, when Jessica left their shared apartment to drive south toward Colorado Springs for what she described as a short visit with friends. She packed a small overnight bag, told her roommate she would return by the evening of December 28th, and drove away in her 1998 Honda Civic just after noon. She never arrived at her destination, never called to explain a change in plans, and never returned to Boulder. The Honda was found on December 30th in the parking lot of a Safeway grocery store on the north side of Colorado Springs, keys still in the ignition, driver's side door unlocked, Jessica's wallet and identification tucked inside the center console. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. The overnight bag she had packed sat untouched in the trunk. Surveillance footage from the grocery store showed the vehicle entering the parking lot at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on December 27th, but the angle of the camera did not capture who was driving or whether anyone else was in the car. By the time store employees noticed the vehicle had been sitting in the same spot for more than 48 hours and called police, any useful trace evidence had been compromised by snow, foot traffic, and the passage of time. The initial investigation moved quickly but produced few answers. Jessica's family cooperated fully, providing phone records, computer access, and detailed statements about her relationships, habits, and mental state. There was no history of depression, no financial trouble, no romantic conflict that might suggest a reason to disappear voluntarily. Friends described her as excited about the new semester, looking forward to an internship opportunity in Rocky Mountain National Park that summer. The people she had planned to visit in Colorado Springs, a couple named Marcus and Denise Hallbrook whom she had known since high school, insisted they had been expecting her but became worried when she never arrived and did not answer calls to her cell phone. Investigators found nothing suspicious in their statements, no inconsistencies, no motive. They were cooperative, concerned, and appropriately distressed by the news of Jessica's disappearance. Search efforts intensified throughout the first week of January 2002. Volunteers combed hiking trails, riverbanks, and abandoned structures within a 50-mile radius of where the Honda had been found. Local news coverage was extensive. Jessica's parents appeared on camera, pleading for information, offering a reward. The case was featured on regional Crime Stoppers programs. Tips poured in, most of them well-meaning but unhelpful. Someone thought they saw a woman matching Jessica's description at a gas station near Pueblo. Another caller reported a suspicious vehicle parked near 11 Mile Reservoir. Every lead was investigated and eliminated. The snow kept falling, covering the landscape in white silence, and as January gave way to February, the searches became less frequent, the media attention faded, and the case file grew thicker with dead ends. The discovery of Jessica's remains on Valentine's Day changed everything and nothing. The location was remote, accessible only by Forest Service roads that were impassable during winter months. A pair of cross-country skiers had ventured off marked trails and noticed what appeared to be fabric partially exposed in a shallow ravine. When investigators arrived and began the painstaking process of excavation, they found Jessica's body buried under rocks and soil in a manner that suggested someone had tried to conceal it quickly. The cold had preserved enough tissue for identification through dental records within 48 hours. Cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. There were no signs of sexual assault. Her clothing, what remained of it, matched what her roommate remembered she had been wearing the day she left Boulder. The autopsy revealed additional details that would prove crucial years later. Jessica had sustained defensive wounds to her hands and forearms, indicating she had fought her attacker. Trace evidence collected from beneath her fingernails included skin cells that yielded a partial DNA profile. But in 2002, the technology to analyze and compare such samples was limited, and the national database contained far fewer profiles than it would in subsequent years. Investigators submitted the evidence to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for analysis and waited. The DNA profile did not match anyone in the system. Without a suspect, without witnesses, without any clear connection between Jessica and the location where her body was found, the case stalled. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who had been in contact with Jessica during the weeks before her death. They looked again at Marcus and Denise Hallbrook, the couple she had planned to visit. Both had alibis for the afternoon of December 27th. Marcus had been at work, a construction site in downtown Colorado Springs where his presence was verified by coworkers and time cards. Denise had been home with their infant son, a fact corroborated by neighbors who remembered seeing her bringing in groceries that afternoon. Phone records showed no calls between Jessica and the Hallbrooks on the day she disappeared. There was no evidence linking them to the crime scene, no motive, no opportunity. Investigators moved on. The case went cold not because police stopped caring, but because every investigative avenue had been exhausted. The file remained open, reviewed periodically by detectives hoping fresh eyes might notice something missed, but as years passed it became one of hundreds of unsolved homicides in Colorado, a tragedy mourned by family and slowly forgotten by everyone else. Jessica's parents held memorial services on the anniversary of her death for the first 5 years, then stopped when the pain became too much to ritualize. Her younger sister graduated college, got married, had children of her own. Life continued in the way it must, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. What changed in 2019 was not new evidence but new technology. Advances in forensic genealogy, the same techniques used to identify the Golden State Killer and dozens of other cold case suspects, allowed investigators to take the partial DNA profile recovered from beneath Jessica's fingernails and compare it against public genealogy databases. The process was painstaking, requiring months of work to build family trees, identify potential matches, and narrow down candidates. By early 2020, investigators had identified a person of interest, someone whose DNA was a familial match to the sample collected 17 years earlier. That person was Marcus Holbrook, the friend Jessica had been traveling to visit the day she disappeared. The revelation that Marcus Holbrook's DNA had been found beneath Jessica Carpenter's fingernails required investigators to completely reassess everything they thought they understood about the case. The problem was not simply that Marcus had been interviewed and cleared in 2002, but that his alibi had seemed ironclad, verified by multiple sources, documented through employment records that placed him miles away from where Jessica was last seen. The question that consumed the reinvestigation team was not whether Marcus had been involved. The DNA evidence made that connection undeniable, but how he had managed to commit murder while simultaneously appearing to be somewhere else entirely. The answer would reveal a conspiracy that had remained hidden for 18 years, protected by a marriage built on secrets and a willingness to lie that investigators had never anticipated. Detective Sarah Brennan, who inherited the case in 2018 as part of the Colorado Springs Police Department's Cold Case Unit, began the process of rebuilding the timeline with the assumption that everything previously accepted as fact needed to be questioned. She started with the construction site where Marcus Holbrook had allegedly been working on December 27, 2001. The company still existed, though under different ownership, and employment records from that period had been transferred to digital archives. Brennan discovered that while Marcus had indeed clocked in that morning at 7:15, the timecard system used in 2001 was manual, requiring workers to punch a physical card that was then collected by a foreman at the end of each shift. There was no way to verify that Marcus had remained on site throughout the entire day, only that his card had been punched at the beginning and end of the shift. Coworkers interviewed in 2002 remembered seeing him that morning, but could not specifically recall seeing him during the afternoon hours when Jessica disappeared. The construction site was located approximately 12 miles from the Safeway where Jessica's Honda had been found. Brennan calculated that if Marcus had left work around noon, he could have intercepted Jessica, committed the murder, disposed of her body, and returned to punch out at the end of his shift without arousing suspicion. But the timing was tight, almost impossibly so, and it required Jessica to have deviated from her planned route for reasons that remained unclear. Brennan needed to understand why Jessica had gone to that particular Safeway. What had drawn her to a location that was not on the direct path between Boulder and the Holbrook residence? The breakthrough came from phone records that had been preserved in the original case file, but never fully analyzed using modern techniques. In 2002, cell phone technology was less sophisticated, and location tracking was crude compared to contemporary standards, but the records still contained valuable information about which cell towers had handled calls to and from Jessica's phone on the day she disappeared. A forensic analyst working with Brennan determined that Jessica's phone had pinged towers consistent with her traveling south from Boulder toward Colorado Springs along Interstate 25, exactly as expected, but that her last call, made at 3:47 in the afternoon, had connected through a tower that covered an area including the Safeway parking lot where her car was eventually found. The call had been placed to a number that investigators in 2002 had traced to a payphone located inside a King Soopers grocery store in northern Colorado Springs. The call had lasted less than 1 minute. Brennan realized that someone had called Jessica from that payphone and directed her to the Safeway location. The question was who? Phone records showed no calls from the Holbrook residence to Jessica's cell phone that day, and Marcus's work phone, a landline at the construction site office, showed no outgoing calls to Jessica's number. Brennan turned her attention to Denise Holbrook, Marcus's wife, whose alibi had been even less thoroughly examined than her husband's. Denise had claimed to be home alone with their infant son, and neighbors had confirmed seeing her that afternoon, but the timeline was vague. One neighbor remembered waving to Denise around 2 o'clock. Another recalled seeing her bringing in groceries around 4:30. That left a window of approximately 2.5 hours unaccounted for. Brennan obtained a warrant to examine financial records from 2001, looking for any transactions that might place Denise near the King Soopers, where the payphone call originated. What she found was a credit card receipt dated December 27, 2001, timestamped at 3:32 in the afternoon, for a purchase of $16.43 at that exact King Soopers location. The purchase had been made on a credit card in Denise's name. The timing aligned perfectly. Denise had been at the store 15 minutes before the call was placed to Jessica's phone from the payphone inside that same store. The picture that emerged was one of careful planning and coordinated deception. Brennan theorized that Denise had lured Jessica to the Safeway under some pretense, perhaps claiming there had been a change of plans or suggesting an alternate meeting location. Jessica, trusting her old friend, had complied. But instead of meeting Denise, she had encountered Marcus, who had left his construction job during the afternoon and driven to the Safeway to intercept her. What happened next could only be reconstructed through forensic evidence and logical inference. The autopsy had determined Jessica died from blunt force trauma, struck multiple times with a heavy object. The defensive wounds suggested a struggle. The DNA beneath her fingernails proved she had scratched her attacker deeply enough to draw blood. Marcus had killed her, likely in his vehicle or in a secondary location near the Safeway, then transported her body to Pike National Forest, where it would not be discovered for nearly 7 weeks. The question that haunted Brennan was why. Jessica and the Holbrooks had been friends since high school. There was no apparent conflict, no romantic entanglement, no financial dispute that might explain such violence. The answer came not from physical evidence, but from interviews with people who had known the Holbrooks in 2001. A former coworker of Marcus's remembered him mentioning that an old friend was planning to visit around the holidays and that he seemed anxious about it. A neighbor recalled Denise appearing stressed in the weeks before Christmas, though she had attributed it at the time to the challenges of caring for an infant. One of Jessica's college friends, re-interviewed in 2020, mentioned something Jessica had said in passing during their last conversation in mid-December. Jessica had seemed troubled, had mentioned that she needed to talk to someone about something she had learned, something involving people she had known for years. She had been vague, had promised to explain after the holidays, and had never had the chance. Brennan suspected that Jessica had discovered something about Marcus or Denise, some secret significant enough that they believed killing her was preferable to allowing her to reveal it. Without direct testimony or written evidence, proving motive would be difficult, but proving murder would not be. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The phone records and credit card receipt placed Denise at the location where the luring call had been made. The gaps in Marcus's workday alibi created opportunity. The case that had seemed unsolvable in 2002 was now prosecutable in 2020. On November 18, 2020, 18 years after Jessica Carpenter's body was discovered in Pike National Forest, Marcus and Denise Holbrook were arrested at their home in Colorado Springs and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrest made regional and national news, featured on true crime podcasts and cable television programs. The Holbrooks' neighbors expressed shock, describing them as quiet, ordinary, the kind of people you would never suspect of anything. Their son, now 18 years old, had no memory of Jessica Carpenter, and no understanding of why his parents were being accused of a crime committed when he was still in diapers. The arrest shattered whatever normal life the Holbrooks had constructed in the years since Jessica's death, but it also brought a measure of closure to Jessica's family, who had waited nearly 2 decades for answers. The prosecution of Marcus and Denise Holbrook presented challenges that extended beyond the typical difficulties of cold case litigation. Nearly 2 decades had passed since Jessica Carpenter's murder. Witnesses had scattered across the country or died. Memories had faded or been distorted by time, and the physical evidence, while compelling, required extensive expert testimony to explain to a jury how forensic genealogy worked and why it could be trusted. The case was assigned to the El Paso County District Attorney's Office, where senior prosecutor Rebecca Winters understood that securing convictions would require not just proving Marcus and Denise had killed Jessica, but explaining why 2 seemingly ordinary people with no criminal history had conspired to murder a friend, and then maintained their silence through years of investigation, vigils, and public appeals. Pre-trial proceedings began in early 2021 and immediately revealed the defense strategy. Marcus Holbrook's attorney argued that the DNA evidence, while proving contact between Marcus and Jessica, did not prove murder. The defense claimed Jessica could have scratched Marcus at any point during a friendly interaction, perhaps days or weeks before her death, and that the DNA had simply persisted beneath her fingernails. This argument was weakened considerably by the prosecution's forensic experts, who testified that DNA degradation and normal hand washing would have eliminated such trace evidence within 24 to 48 hours. The scratches that produced the DNA found beneath Jessica's fingernails had occurred during a violent struggle, not a casual encounter. Denise Holbrook's defense took a different approach. Her attorney maintained that while Denise may have been at the King Soopers where the payphone call originated, there was no proof she had made that call. The credit card receipt placed her in the store, but the payphone itself had long since been removed, and no surveillance footage from 2001 had been preserved. Without direct evidence connecting Denise to the phone call, her attorney argued, the prosecution's theory was speculation. The problem with this defense was that it required the jury to believe in an extraordinary coincidence, that Denise happened to be in the exact location where a call luring Jessica to her death was made, at the precise time that call occurred, without having any involvement in that call. The trial began on September 14, 2021, in an El Paso County courtroom that was filled to capacity with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and members of Jessica's family who had waited 19 years for this moment. Judge Catherine Morrison presided over proceedings that would last 7 weeks and include testimony from more than 60 witnesses. The prosecution's case was methodical, building layer upon layer of evidence that individually might seem circumstantial but collectively created an overwhelming picture of guilt. Phone records, credit card receipts, employment documents, cell tower data, and forensic analysis were presented in sequence, each piece supporting the next, constructing a timeline that left little room for alternative explanations. The testimony that resonated most powerfully with the jury came not from forensic experts but from people who had known Jessica. Her college roommate described the last morning she saw Jessica, how excited she had been about the upcoming semester, how she had promised to return by evening and had never broken a promise before. Jessica's younger sister, now a mother of 3, testified about the years of not knowing, the holidays marked by absence, the graduations and weddings Jessica never attended. The emotional weight of these testimonies was balanced by Detective Sarah Brennan's measured recounting of the investigation, her explanation of how new technology had allowed investigators to identify Marcus Holbrook when previous methods had failed, and her walking the jury through every step of the timeline reconstruction that placed both defendants in position to commit the crime. The defense called fewer witnesses and focused primarily on attacking the reliability of forensic genealogy as an investigative tool. Expert witnesses testified about the potential for contamination, for distant relatives to share DNA markers, for the technology to produce false positives. These arguments were undermined during cross-examination when prosecution experts demonstrated that the DNA match to Marcus Holbrook was not merely suggestive but definitive, with probability statistics that made random chance virtually impossible. The defense also attempted to present Marcus and Denise as devoted parents, community members, people whose 18 years of unremarkable suburban life since Jessica's death proved they could not be murderers. The prosecution countered by pointing out that the ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while carrying the secret of a murder was not evidence of innocence, but evidence of calculation. Neither Marcus nor Denise Holbrook testified in their own defense, exercising their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. This decision, while legally protected, created an absence in the courtroom that the prosecution exploited during closing arguments. Rebecca Winters asked the jury to consider what innocent people would do when accused of murder, whether they would remain silent or take the stand to proclaim their innocence and explain away the evidence. The silence of the defendants, she argued, spoke volumes about their guilt and their inability to provide any explanation that would withstand scrutiny. The question of motive remained the most speculative element of the prosecution's case. Without a confession or testimony from the defendants, Winters could only theorize about why Marcus and Denise had killed Jessica. The theory she presented to the jury was based on fragments of evidence and logical inference. She suggested that Jessica had learned something about the Holbrooks, perhaps related to Marcus's employment or finances, perhaps something darker, and had planned to confront them or report what she knew. The Holbrooks, facing exposure, had made the calculation that murdering their friend was preferable to allowing her to reveal whatever secret she had discovered. Winters acknowledged this was speculation, but argued that the lack of a clear motive did not negate the overwhelming evidence that the murder had occurred and that Marcus and Denise were responsible. The defense closing arguments emphasized reasonable doubt, the gaps in the timeline, the lack of witnesses who saw Marcus leave his construction job or saw either defendant with Jessica on the day she disappeared. They argued that the prosecution had built an impressive theory, but had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Marcus and Denise had conspired to commit murder. The jury would need to decide whether the circumstantial evidence, however compelling, was sufficient to convict. Jury deliberations began on November 2, 2021, and lasted 4 days. The length of deliberations suggested the jury was taking seriously their responsibility to examine every element of the case. On November 6th, they returned with verdicts. Marcus Holbrook was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Denise Holbrook was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder, but the jury could not reach unanimous agreement on the first-degree murder charge against her, believing the evidence proved she had facilitated the crime, but had not been present when Jessica was killed. The verdicts represented a victory for the prosecution, though not a complete one. Both defendants would face significant prison sentences, but only Marcus would be held directly accountable for Jessica's death. Sentencing took place on January 11, 2022, in the same courtroom where the trial had been held. Judge Morrison heard impact statements from Jessica's family, who spoke about 2 decades of grief, of milestones marked by absence, of the exhaustion that comes from years of uncertainty, finally replaced by the exhaustion of knowing the truth. Jessica's mother, now 71 years old, addressed Marcus and Denise directly, asking them why they had never shown mercy, never confessed, never allowed the family to find peace sooner. Neither defendant responded or showed visible emotion. Marcus Holbrook was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Denise Holbrook received 30 years, with eligibility for parole after 20. The sentences reflected the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of the conspiracy. Judge Morrison stated during sentencing that the defendants had not only taken Jessica's life, but had compounded that crime by allowing her family to suffer for nearly 2 decades without answers, maintaining their innocence even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. The judge noted that whatever secret Jessica had discovered, whatever motivated the murder, would likely remain unknown unless the defendants chose to reveal it, and their continued silence suggested they never would. The appeals process began almost immediately after sentencing, with both Marcus and Denise Holbrook's attorneys filing motions challenging the admissibility of the forensic genealogy evidence and arguing that the convictions had been based on insufficient evidence. The Colorado Court of Appeals heard arguments in October 2022 and issued a ruling in March 2023 that upheld both convictions, finding that the DNA evidence had been properly collected and analyzed, that the chain of custody had been maintained according to standards, and that the jury had been presented with sufficient evidence to reach guilty verdicts. The defense petitioned the Colorado Supreme Court for review, but that petition was denied in August 2023, making the convictions final. Marcus Holbrook is currently incarcerated at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City, serving his life sentence in administrative segregation due to threats from other inmates who learned the details of his case. He has given no interviews, made no public statements, and according to prison records, has received visits only from his attorney. Denise Holbrook is serving her sentence at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility, where she has participated in educational programs and maintains contact with her son, now in his early 20s, who has reportedly struggled with the knowledge of what his parents did before he was old enough to remember them as anything other than the people who raised him. The question that has never been answered, the mystery that persists even after the convictions, is what Jessica Carpenter had discovered that made Marcus and Denise believe murder was their only option. Detective Brennan investigated this question as thoroughly as she investigated the murder itself, but without cooperation from the defendants, she could never confirm her suspicions. Financial records from 2001 showed no obvious irregularities. Background checks revealed no hidden criminal activity. Interviews with people who knew the Holbrooks in that period produced no smoking gun, no revelation that would explain the motive. Brennan's working theory, never proven but supported by circumstantial indicators, was that Marcus had been involved in some form of fraud or theft at his construction job, and that Jessica had somehow learned about it, perhaps through a mutual acquaintance or by accidentally seeing documents during a previous visit to the Holbrook home. The theory suggested that Marcus faced potential criminal charges and job loss if exposed, and that he and Denise had decided eliminating the witness was preferable to facing consequences. But without evidence or confession, this remained speculation, a narrative that fit the facts but could never be verified. Jessica's family found closure not in understanding why she died, but in knowing who was responsible and seeing justice served. Her parents both passed away in 2023, her father in April and her mother in November, having lived long enough to see the trial conclude but not long enough to see the appeals exhausted. They were buried in Fort Collins, in plots adjacent to where Jessica's remains had been laid to rest 21 years earlier. The headstone erected at Jessica's grave after her parents' deaths includes an inscription that reads simply, "Finally at peace together." The family maintains a small memorial website where friends and former classmates occasionally post memories, photographs from happier times, and messages reflecting on how Jessica's case influenced their understanding of how fragile safety can be and how long justice can take. The case changed how Colorado law enforcement approaches cold cases involving DNA evidence. The success of forensic genealogy in identifying Marcus Holbrook led to the creation of a dedicated cold case genetic genealogy unit within the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, staffed by analysts trained specifically in building family trees from forensic DNA samples. Since 2020, this unit has helped solve 14 additional cold cases across the state, bringing resolution to families who had waited decades for answers. Detective Sarah Brennan, whose persistence drove the reinvestigation, was promoted to sergeant and continues to work cold cases, applying the lessons learned from Jessica's case to other investigations where conventional methods had failed. The Safeway parking lot where Jessica's Honda was found still exists, though the store has been remodeled twice since 2001 and the parking lot repaved. Nothing marks the location as significant. The section of Pike National Forest where her body was discovered remains remote and rarely visited, accessible only during summer months when the Forest Service roads are passable. There is no memorial there, no marker indicating what happened in that clearing. The forest has reclaimed the site completely, and someone hiking through would never know that beneath the pine needles and snow that accumulates each winter, a young woman's life ended violently and was hidden for 63 days. The case of Jessica Lynn Carpenter represents both the limitations and possibilities of cold case investigation. For 18 years, the case was unsolvable, constrained by the technology available in 2002 and by the assumption that people who appeared cooperative and normal could not be capable of murder. The advancement of forensic genealogy made the impossible suddenly achievable, allowing investigators to connect Marcus Holbrook to the crime through science that had not existed when Jessica died. But technology alone did not solve the case. It required Detective Brennan's willingness to question every assumption, to rebuild the timeline from scratch, to recognize that alibis that seemed solid might have been constructed carefully to deceive. The story ends not with dramatic revelation or cathartic confession, but with the quiet reality of justice delayed but eventually delivered. Marcus and Denise Holbrook will spend the remainder of their lives in prison, the secret they killed to protect still unknown. Jessica's family has the small comfort of knowing her murderers were identified and convicted, even if they never fully understand why it happened. The case file, once thick with dead ends and unanswered questions, is now closed and archived, one among thousands, a reminder that some truths take decades to surface, but that persistence, technology, and careful investigation can eventually bring even the coldest cases to resolution.